Greetings to all grade 12 learners. Molweni nonke bafundi. This is Ms. M Nonkasa, the Provincial History Planner. Today you will be dealing with a topic that is in paper 2, which is the Black Consciousness Movement in South Africa during the 1970s. This is the topic that is done in term 2. It appears in paper 1 as the first question, as the very first question in paper 1, and it is examined as a source-based question. Remember, in term 1, you did topics under paper 1, and you had source-based questions there and essays. Your Cuban Missile Crisis, your Angola Black Power Movement, those were the source-based questions. So in paper 2, you will do Black Consciousness Movement. So it will be your question 1. Remember, when you're given the source-based questions, you'll be looking at the sources. You'll be given 4 sources maximum. That is a combination of written sources and the visual sources. So in those sources, you'll be tested on the different skills. For example, you'll be tested on the extraction skill. That is where you get information directly from the source. For example, you will have questions like identify from the source, what according to the source, list, name. Those are the question verbs that will be used. At the same time, you'll be expected to define concepts in their historical concepts. So all those fall under the level 1 questions. Those are the questions that we say they are very easy to get. Those are low-hanging fruits where you are supposed to get all the marks, the 14 marks that are allocated there. And then you will also be expected to interpret information from the sources that you are given. Remember, I said you're given both visual sources and the written sources. So from those sources, you will explain the information that is there. You will be expected to comment on the information that is given there. At the same time, you will be expected to interpret the visual sources. For example, you can expect a question that says, what message is conveyed by a particular visual source that is given. And then thirdly, you will engage with the sources to determine whether the sources are reliable or not. You look at the limitations of the source. What is it that the source is not revealing? At the same time, you will compare 2 sources, your visual source and your written source, where you look at either the similarities or the differences between the sources. You will also determine the usefulness of the source. How useful is the source? The source can be useful, it can also not be useful. And then the last question that will carry more marks on the source-based question will be your paragraph writing question, where you will be expected to write a paragraph of about 8 lines or 80 words, depending on the question that is given there. So it is important that on the sources that you have been given, in each source, you write little notes next to each source to write what the source is all about. That will assist you when in the end you are writing your paragraph question, so that you don't get to quote the source verbatim, but you rather write the paragraph in your own words so that you don't get penalized. So that's the gist of the source-based question. So this topic that we'll be looking at is a source-based question. So those are the type of questions that you will expect from them. Then the key question there is, how did the Black Consciousness Movement challenge the apartheid state? So those are the focus areas that we are going to deal with. For example, we look at the nature and the aims of the Black consciousness. We look at the role of Stephen Bantu Biko, the role that he played in conscientizing South Africans about the ideas of the Black consciousness. So Steve Biko was the main proponent of the Black consciousness. And then we'll look into detail in terms of the ideals of the Black consciousness movement and how it was implemented there. Then we look at the 1976 Soweto uprising by the students and how they were influenced by the ideas of the Black consciousness. And lastly, the legacy of Black consciousness. What role did it play in the South African politics? How did it shape the politics of the country? So looking at the concepts, when you are given any topic, you would have seen how your teachers approach the topics. They would identify the concepts that you're going to come across with in the topic. And in each and every question paper that we are given, there will always be one or two concepts that are asked there at 2 marks each. So it is important that you highlight all the concepts that you come across in each topic, and then you explain them. They must be contained in your notebooks. For example, we have apartheid, which was the South Africa's policy of separate development under the National Party government. This is not a new concept because you dealt with this topic in grade 11. Remember, it was done in term 3 and 4, which is apartheid South Africa, where you dealt with the resistance to apartheid. So this is not a new concept. So you are used to this policy of separate development that was implemented by the National Party government. Then the civil protest, which is the opposition by the ordinary citizens of the country. Usually they oppose the policies of the government, which are regarded to be unfair and unjust. So that protest by the ordinary citizens is referred to as civil protest. Then the key one now, which is the Black consciousness, around which this whole theme is centered. It was a philosophy that was inspired by Steve Biko, which sought to instill pride and affirm common identity of the Black South Africans. It was a philosophy that was advocated by Steve Biko so that South Africans get rid of their inferiority complex and gain their psychological freedom through self-reliance, self-assertiveness, and Black pride. As we go on with the lesson, you will see how Steve Biko encouraged people to rely on themselves rather than relying on the assistance from the white people. And then the ideology, what we mean by that. In grade 11, you dealt with so many ideologies, and then this is a system of beliefs, that is a set of ideas which shapes one's actions. So we'll be dealing with that ideology here. Then Black Consciousness Movement, which is an inclusive term used to refer to all the organizations embracing the ideology of Black consciousness. So those are just a few concepts that you will come across with as you are dealing with this topic. Then as a form of background to this Black consciousness movement, we'll start at how the situation was around the 1960s. Remember, I said this is something that you covered in grade 11, so it serves as a background to what we are going to talk about. This is the picture of Steve Biko. Remember, I said as you will be given these sources, you will be given both written sources and visual sources. So this is an example of a photograph, which is a visual source. But when you are given a task, it will have a contextualization, and then it will be sourced at the bottom there. During this period, around the 1960s, remember there was a Sharpeville massacre. So after the Sharpeville massacre, the political parties, the liberation movements were banned by the government of the time. So there was very little protest in South Africa in the mid 1960s due to the state repression, meaning that around that period there were new legislations that were introduced by the government so as to suppress all the protests that were taking place. For example, anybody who was having an action there, then they were either arrested or they were under detention without any trial that was being done. So during that period, it was just a period where the leaders were either in exile or some of them were in prison for quite a number of years. So it was during that time that there was the emergence of the new form of protest, which was the Black consciousness. Then Steve Biko was the main person who was the proponent of this Black consciousness, and he was influenced by a number of things or by the number of people to follow this Black consciousness. For example, he was influenced by Robert Sobukwe. You will remember that Robert Sobukwe was the leader of the Pan Africanist Congress, which broke away from the ANC because Robert Sobukwe could not agree with the concept of non-racialism that was depicted in the Freedom Charter. So he believed that the blacks should be responsible for their own liberation. So that influenced the philosophy of the Black consciousness as led by Steve Biko. Secondly, the content that you dealt with in term one, you dealt with the civil rights movements in USA in the 1950s and the 1960s. You also dealt with the Black Power movement in USA. Then the successes of these movements, as led by Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, they also influenced Steve Biko. You will recall that Malcolm X, the approach, as we're going to deal with the Black consciousness, you will see that there are similarities in the way things that were done by the Black Power movement and the Black consciousness, because they advocated for Black pride, that people should have interest in their own history. They should embrace who they are. They should be proud in their blackness. They should be proud of themselves. So those are the principles that were followed by the Black consciousness movement in South Africa as well. So the approach was the same together with this civil rights movement. So the successes in terms of achieving their liberation in US then influenced how the Black consciousness movement dealt with the issue of oppression in South Africa. Then another thing that was a motivation that also influenced Steve Biko was the decolonization that took place in Africa. For example, you in term one, you dealt with Angola, how Angola got independence. You dealt with Congo and Tanzania, which is a comparative study. So those independent movements in South Africa, they also influenced the thinking around the Black consciousness movement. And lastly, the Pan-Africanists like Marcus Garvey and Du Bois, they called for unity of all Africans. So that influenced the Black consciousness, because the Pan-Africanism created solidarity and unity among the Africans, and that contributed towards the decolonization that we have talked about in the previous bullet. So those are the things that influenced the Black consciousness movement. So why was it necessary for the Black consciousness in the late 1960s? Remember, we said during that period there was this apartheid government which applied a policy of divide and rule. The apartheid government created homelands. If I know you are born free, but you know that there were homelands like Transkei, Ciskei, Venda, Bophuthatswana, and there were also dependent dependent homelands. So all those homelands were created such that in each one there are different African language groups, and even in their urban planning policies, the townships were divided into different language groups. So the main aim of the of the apartheid government was to divide black people so as to prevent them in uniting as black people that will resist apartheid. So it was a principle of divide and rule. So it tried to push a policy of separate but equal, and that of separate development. So there was an issue of whites this side and the blacks that side. So it was an issue of separate development. So that creation of homelands, then it meant that you will have your blacks being allocated in the different homelands without interference of other races, the white people in particular. Then Steve Biko believed that it was essential to strip away the language of separate development so that we see apartheid for what it was, that it was a racist policy which oppressed the black people because of their color. So what were the main aims of the black consciousness? This is the area where you are going to be examined on. Remember, I highlighted the focus areas for this particular topic. So what I was giving was just a background to the black consciousness movement. So the black consciousness started as an attitude of mind rather than a political movement. Remember, I said to you earlier when I was defining the black consciousness, it was a philosophy that advocated that blacks should be self-reliant, they should have that psychological freedom so that they get rid of those feelings of inferiority. So to Steve Biko, all those that were oppressed by the apartheid government, all those that they were categorized as blacks, meaning that even if you were colored, an Indian, you just fell under the category of black people, because if you were not privileged, if you were oppressed by the apartheid government, then it means that you were a black South African. So it was not a matter of pigmentation, but it was just a mental attitude. So all those that were oppressed by the apartheid government, they were categorized as blacks. So the black consciousness aimed to raise black confidence so as to bring about liberation, because at the end of the day, what they were striving for was to liberate the Africans, but it has to start here, the liberation of the mind. Then the black consciousness promoted pride in black identity, culture, and history, meaning that Steve Biko wanted black people to be proud of who they are, just like how the Black Power movement was doing it, to be proud of their blackness. They should embrace their own culture rather than having their culture being assimilated by the Western culture. You wanted people to take interest in their own history, just to know what you are all about. You must know where you come from so that you know what you're going to. So it was important that people take pride in their identity, just to know who they are. They embrace their culture and also to take interest in their history. So he challenged the white liberals. The reason why he was challenging those white liberals was that he was saying they have benefited from the apartheid government. So there was no way that they could play a role in the liberation of a black person, which is why he was saying the black people should be at the center stage of their own liberation. So in this process, he was promoting black unity. Remember, we're talking colors, we're talking blacks, we're talking Indians. So because you were saying all those people, they fall under this one category because they are all oppressed by the white government. So he promoted black unity. You will recall that I have said earlier on he was influenced by Pan-Africanism, meaning that Pan-Africanism was the one that was advocating for solidarity and unity so that people could fight for their own liberation. So this worked in terms of influencing the black consciousness. So he stated that the black the black people to have to nurture their black identity than being assimilated by white culture. So it means it's the responsibility of black people to preserve their culture, to protect their culture so that it doesn't get overshadowed the white by the white culture. He advocated self-respect and confidence. Those were the values that he wanted to instill on the black people so that when they fight for their freedom, at least they are confident enough to face this animal, which was the apartheid government. He encouraged self-reliance and discouraged reliance on whites. Remember, I said to you, we're still going to do the ideas of the black consciousness and how it was implemented. Then we'll talk about the self-help projects, the community projects that were set up by Steve Biko so that black people could rely on themselves rather than relying on the assistance that they get from the white government. He wanted people to rely on themselves, to do things for themselves. So that was the main aim of the black consciousness. Again, the liberation of the mind. I think the first bullet there was talking to the attitude of the mind. He wanted blacks to liberate themselves psychologically so that they don't see themselves as being inferior than the white people, because you'll find that sometimes people see whites as being superior than the blacks. So once you have that mentality that this person is superior than the other person, then it means that the person who's seen to be inferior will lose confidence. So that's why he was advocating for confidence, self-respect, confidence, and then that leads to liberation of the mind. So he promoted psychological freedom so that people can get rid of all those feelings of inferiority, because everybody is supposed to be equal in this land. So as soon as we liberate our minds, then it becomes easier to face the enemy. This is the quotation that you will come across as you read the the books that have been written by Steve Biko, the question papers, the previous year's question papers. You will get to see this source. This is a visual source with a message that's in there, which says the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Meaning that when Steve Biko is talking about the liberation of the mind, he means that people should be free psychologically so that the oppressor does not have hold over this oppressed person, because he's saying the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed person. So once we free ourselves in the mind, once we free ourselves psychologically, then it means that we are just getting rid of all those feelings of inferiority, and then that defeats the purpose of the oppressor. So that's what he advocated. So those are the aims of the black consciousness. So this ideology, it united the supporters of the ANC and the PAC for the liberation of South Africa, because at least they could relate with the the aims and the nature of this Black consciousness, as the ANC, the PAC was banned during that period. So they could relate with this ideology, which is the Black consciousness movement. So the main aim of this lesson was mainly to look at the nature and the aims of the Black consciousness. So as we move forward with other lessons, we'll look at the actual role of Steve Biko. We'll get to know who Steve Biko was, what was his actual role, how did he influence the communities, how did he influence the students in the 1976 Soweto uprising. So those lessons cannot be finished in one day. So we'll just stop here for now. What we have done, we have issued out worksheets specifically on this topic. So as soon as you are done watching this, please take those worksheets and then you look at the sources that are there, and then the questions that follow. Read the sources. You either read, because you are at home, you read the sources silently and you also read them aloud so that you understand what the sources are all about. You take little notes on the side to say this source is about this, so that when you respond to the questions, at least you know what the sources are all about. And then you must have a dictionary next to you, so that if you come across a difficult word in the source that is not explained in brackets, then you write the meaning of that particular word, because it is important to understand the source so that you are able to respond to the questions. So take a look at those worksheets and try to work from home. Wishing you all the best as you try to make sense of those sources and the questions. Then we meet next time. Thank you.